interwar period delineate not an anti-internationalist opposition between two internationalist presidencies, but in fact are a bridge that often link the new freedom to the New Deal. So if you haven't followed that close summary, I'll provide some meat on that skeleton structure right now. In my first section, I would like to argue that Wilson's policies it attempted to envision a new freedom expanded to the world. Professor Brownlee this morning stressed two important elements of Wilson's domestic policy. That was his anti-monopoly views and his conviction that central banking was important for a stable monetary structure. I would argue a similar view that these kinds of economic arrangements were necessary, also characterized his taking the new freedom into the world. And in this, I think I'm going to enter some of the discussion we had in the last panel related to Wilson and Mexico. I would argue, from yet a third perspective than either of the two that we heard earlier, that Wilson actually had very little use for businesses that behaved badly in other countries and then called on the U.S. government to support them. And I think that Mexico represents a very good example of that proposition. Throughout his administration, Wilson refused to assist U.S. oil and mining interests that he believed were feeding some of the instability in Mexico. When he intervened against the government of Victoriano Huerta, part of the reason was that he believed this coup was backed by Anglo, but also American oil companies, and he regarded that as illegitimate. When he intervened in Mexico, he felt that not only would he come to the rescue of Mexican nationalism, an illusory thought, as Professor Gilderhus mentioned, but he also hoped to teach American oil companies a lesson, that if they were going to undermine constitutional processes in the rest of the hemisphere, they were not going to get the backing of the U.S. government. Again, at the end of the war, as the previous discussion alluded to, the oil companies put tremendous pressure on the Wilson administration to intervene in Mexico. And here I will side with Professor Cooper in lauding Wilson for, again, for refusing to accede to such pressure. The last thing Wilson wanted, and he said so throughout his presidency, was that government should be the agent or the arm of private interests that wanted to undermine stability in countries or to create monopoly. He chastised oil companies and other sort of buccaneer capitalists who might confuse their own private profits with the national interest. Another good example of this occurred during his presidency in Costa Rica. There, United Fruit was behind a coup and installed a government that was more to its liking. And Wilson was furious, despite his administration's close ties to many people in the fruit company. He was so angry that he used wartime controls to embargo that country and gave United Fruit to know that he would keep those controls on and make the economy of that country so bad, and by implication United Fruit in such distress, that he would not recognize the regime and that he would keep the pressure on until it was overthrown, as indeed he did, although he was entreated by United Fruit constantly to reverse that policy. Now, what I want to claim here is that these policies were examples. They provided warnings to individual U.S. businesses that they needed to be good citizens in other countries and they needed to promote rather than undermine constitutional stability. This could be taken by some as having been anti-business, but of course to Wilson, this was in the larger interests of a stable capitalist order. Now, for those businesses that behaved responsibly, in Wilson's view, the government was always there to help. And the Wilson administration built a rather substantial bureaucracy which provided assistance. The cabinet offices of Commerce, Treasury, State Department each developed specialized promotional bureaucracies that helped, that assisted business. The Wilson administration even adopted a very affirmative policy toward the expansion of American oil companies, adopting open-door policies. So he was certainly for the spread of global capitalism. He just didn't want government to be used as an arm of particularist business interests for private profit. At the end of the war, Wilson's administrations turned to the U.S. banking community, which had been newly reorganized, as Professor Brownlee said, under the Federal Reserve Bank system. And he saw this sort of public-private entity now, the Federal Reserve working with large bankers, as a potential tool for implementing a new stabilizing financial architecture for the post-war world. As the war drew to a close, the Wilson administration worked especially with Thomas Lamont and the Morgan interests to develop plans for using America's now gigantic capital resources to construct the world and expand the gold standard and regularize a system of currency convertibility among nations to recycle American wealth back into the world and revive world trade. As part of this attempt to work with banks toward a stable post-war order, Wilson sought to enlarge the number of countries whose public finances would be directly supervised by American experts. And he had this notion that American bankers could offer loans and thereby leverage American supervision and therefore stabilize the entire system. The point here was, of course, not to promote bank profits, but to work with banks to provide an American, or in some cases an Anglo-American, financial umbrella that would be a kind of stabilizing economic counterpart to the League of Nations collective security plan. This vision of Wilson then envisions or sees the new freedom as being one that gets extended to the world, which sees the regulation of exploitative capital practices being important for the stability of and spread of capitalism generally. Now, in the interwar period, this focus on government's relationship to large capital interests complicates the traditional narrative about isolationists and internationalists. Bear with me while I make this argument. After the war, drawing support from the widespread public disillusionment over World War I, the Republican administrations of the 1920s constructed an alternative to Wilsonianism. And that was a very unilateralist and nationalist foreign policy that emphasized private sector rather than government-to-government relationships. They took the United States in a very nationalist direction, refusing to work with the United Nations, join the World Court, or cancel World War II war debts. They sponsored immigrant restriction acts, undertook interventions in what nationalists considered the U.S. sphere of interest in the Caribbean, and they generally pressed a nationalist view of international economic policy. Where Wilson had emphasized a guiding role for professionalized government bureaus and economic experts, his Republican successors saw little problem with providing energetic government assistance to the various private interests without interfering much in their practices, as the unhealthy binge of private lending during the 1920s that presaged the Great Depression would show. Now, as the farm depression spread during the 20s, resentment against this policy that tended to favor economic interests grew very, very strong, and especially a resentment against bankers among farm state legislators. Farm state legislators, for example, led a coalition of politicians that promoted congressional hearings in the mid-1920s. And the point of these hearings was to reveal how American private bank loans had sparked U.S. military occupations and then wars in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and in Nicaragua. These farm state progressives distrusted the influence of economic elites that they claimed could call up the power of the state and define national interest on their own behalf. And you can see how these arguments echoed some of the progressive sentiments that Wilson himself had expressed. These arguments of farm state progressives during the 20s and 30s often resonated with urban allies. Irish, Italian, and German ethnics, especially those opposed to ties with imperialist Britain, union movements that were influenced by anti-British ethnic politics, localistic business interests, NAACP leaders who were especially outspoken on the military occupation of Haiti, coalitions of anti-war, very right-wing mothers' movements, left-wing women's movements, pacifists, socialists. There were leaders from all of these groups that worked together in the 20s and the early 30s, not as isolationists, and they certainly didn't call themselves that, but they worked together as internationalists that opposed what they called dollar diplomacy. That is the fear that bankers would lead the government into wars, as they believed was happening then, they believed had happened in World War I, and also believed was happening at the moment in Dominican Republic, in Haiti, and in Nicaragua. The war in Nicaragua in the late 1920s, which was one of the most prominent foreign policy controversies of their interwar era, although it has almost been forgotten now. That war became so unpopular domestically that President Coolidge had to remove troops after Congress threatened to cut off military funding for the military effort. So this opposition to dollar diplomacy, which was so strong in the mid and late 20s and early 30s, was a very strong sentiment in the country. And it grew stronger in the early 30s with two spectacular congressional commissions which were designed to expose corporate corruption and malfeasance. One was a congressional committee that hauled the country's leading international bankers before it and publicly excoriated them for their lending practices. This was, of course, in the early 30s when things were tumbling down. And another committee headed by Gerald Nye that investigated the nefarious pre-World War I influence of bankers and munitions makers. Under this critique that the fear that large capital interests had captured government policy and was dragging the country into wars that were really not in its interests, this is the genesis of what then came to be called isolationism. But I think if we understand it going forward from the 1920s rather than backwards from the 40s, we understand more of what it was about. It was about anti-interventionism, and it had strong, progressive, anti-monopoly themes. I think it makes more sense to call it anti-interventionism than isolationism. Well, it was in this context that Roosevelt came to power, or was elected in 1932, promising to, quote, chase the moneylenders out of the temple, using this, again, this very progressive rhetoric that actually binds him both back to Wilson and then through the anti-interventionists of the interwar period. And again in 36, Roosevelt campaigned by invoking the progressive themes that the political and economic system needed to be protected, he said, from, quote, concentrations of economic power. So that opposition to war, even, yeah, I've already made that point. Let's see. So, as the Roosevelt administration devises its policy, it echoes some of these same progressive themes that were so strong in the Wilson administration and in this anti-war period. Roosevelt, of course, begins to take this anti-war coalition. He calls it isolationism, and then he labels it as all Republican. But if you actually examine the people who were anti-war in the interwar period, it was a very diverse coalition that wasn't marked by region or class or party, or it was marked by this anti-monopoly discourse, most prominently. The center point I want to make about the Roosevelt administration then has to do with its own attempt to create an architecture that would reflect this notion of reformed capitalism. That is, the need to curb interests and monopoly interests. And I think that the best example of this is with regard to the creation of the Bretton Woods monetary reforms. Like Wilson, Roosevelt also fashioned during the war a close working relationship with business interests that he felt would would healthily promote the interests of capitalism. But he also worked toward an international financial structure that would stand apart from them and would put experts in charge. And these particularly were centered around the Treasury Department, where Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau worked to shift international monetary policy away from the power of the private banks, which had become dominant in the setting of policies in the interwar period, and re-envisioned a new system in which some kind of international body with economic expertise could set the rules and wrest that power a little bit away from private banks. And the person who carried this reform program in the Treasury Department was, of course, the architect of the Bretton Woods system, Harry Dexter White. These new dealers had their perspectives shaped by what they regarded as the failure of the interwar years. And that was a view, actually, that wasn't all that dissimilar from that of the anti-interventionists during those years. That is, that the practices of private bankers had contributed to the instabilities leading to the Great Depression, that there was an inability of national governments and international cooperative efforts to be able to reverse a cycle of economic decline, that you needed to be able to short-circuit competitive devaluations of currency, and you needed to find a way around the inflexibility of gold standard rules. So this new generation of economic experts that were housed primarily in the Treasury sought to create a new institutional system that could do all of those things. Well, I won't go into the details of the Bretton Woods Agreement here for lack of time. But I will say that one of the outcomes of it is that Roosevelt did learn something from Wilson's failure in the League, which was he was very scared about being so inflexible that he wouldn't get what his post-war vision required. And in the negotiation of Bretton Woods, when they took it to Congress, he did compromise a good bit with the banking community. Bretton Woods did get accepted, but it got accepted in somewhat of a lesser form than his Treasury Department had initially wanted. By the time the Board of Governors and of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank first met, John Maynard Keynes, who was also an architect of Bretton Woods, said, well, the boys of the New Deal are now being eliminated. And in fact, he felt that Truman had whacked away at this reformed capitalism legacy and had turned it in a more nationalist direction. Nevertheless, at their inception at least, these institutions had represented the legacy of reformed capitalism that I believe that Wilson had also once represented. So in conclusion, I just wanted to sum up that I have tried to offer two interrelated arguments. First is that the New Freedom and the New Deal both drew from a critique of unregulated private power that was very widely shared in America during the first half of the 20th century. and they both sought to create a reformed structure of capitalism guided and regulated through expertise. In that sense, they both exemplify what Daniel Yergin has described as the very long 20th century swing to give the state some control over what John Maynard Keynes called the commanding heights. And they were both part of that swing of government power and regulation. Of course, Wilson and Roosevelt adopted different approaches. Wilson's was much more voluntary. It was an earlier age. Bretton Woods was a much more institutional response built against the lessons of the Great Depression. But nevertheless, both of them envisioned a system in which government guidance and expertise would shape the stability of a system and wring out the kind of buccaneer capitalism that thought only of profits. My second point has been that in the traditional historiography of the Wilson-FDR continuum, there has tended to be a focus on internationalism as international organizations. But I think it's useful to look away from simply international organizations and look at this progressive reform tradition that certainly was alive in both administrations. Further, I would like to point out that this progressive reform tradition was also very strong in the interwar era, and that the traditional internationalist isolationist dichotomy that we have seen usually talked about in foreign policy doesn't fit very well if you're looking through the lens of international reformed capitalism. The equation of internationalism with collective security organizations has tended to eclipse the visibility of the economic critique that I think was so strong in politics in the first half of the 20th century, this progressive internationalism. And so that's what I wanted to call attention to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That's a very useful introduction of some economic themes to this discussion. Our second presentation is by Martin Walker, who will look at the Cold War years. And I want to say a special word of thanks to Martin, who filled in on relatively short notice with what I'm sure will be a good paper and a good presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll probably already have realized from my accent that I represent the international bit of the International Center for Scholars, although I'd like to try and persuade you that we Brits aren't quite as alien as all that, despite what many of your historians say. I mean, some of them seem to think that your Great War of Independence was some kind of British setback or even a British defeat. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was, of course, a case of British settlers fighting for age-old British rights against Hessian mercenaries under a German king. Naturally, therefore, we won. Now, one of the interesting things about talking about Woodrow Wilson is I think he's the only president who can claim to have spawned his own ism. Now, I once did a series of programs for the BBC, which I called Clintonism. It didn't catch on, not at all. And I see that our current president has inspired a book called Bushism, but it's rather rude about his misunderestimations and misspeakings. We've had Jacksonian, but not quite Jacksonianism. We've had Kennedy-esque, but I think Wilson is probably unique in having his own ism, which says quite a lot about him. And I think it reflects the way in which Woodrow Wilson managed to inspire some of the world's most memorable and splendid vituperative attacks. Now, although I'm a Brit, I'm not going to echo some of my great countrymen. For example, Lord Bertie, the British ambassador in Paris in the First World War, who said that Wilson and his government, quote, are a rotten lot of psalm-singing, profit-mongering humbugs. Nor do I intend to echo the great liberal historian Sir George Trevelyan, who wrote to his friend Lord Bryce, a noted American scholar, that Woodrow Wilson is surely the very quintessence of a prig. And no foreigner could hope quite to match the vituperation of your own great H.L. Mencken, who noted that, quote, Archangel Wilson is positioning himself for the first vacancy in the Holy Trinity. Now, why is it that I have the temerity to try and talk about Wilson in the Cold War when it really began over a quarter of a century after he left office? Well, one reason is that so many scholars have stressed the relevance of Wilson to the Cold War. One of them I'm delighted to see here today, who noted that, quote, in the Cold War, Wilsonianism was normalized as a way of dealing with a threat of infinite duration. In reversal of traditional geopolitical logic, it became the Cold War's realism. That's as neat a way of handling the dichotomy between Wilson's supposed idealism and the realist critics as I've ever seen. Henry Kissinger made the point that Woodrow Wilson's principles have remained the bedrock of America's foreign policy thinking. For whenever America faced the task of constructing a new world order, it's returned in one way or another to Wilson's precepts. It's above all to the drumbeat of American idealism that American foreign policy has marched since his watershed presidency, and it continues to march to this day. But it's not just the historians who acknowledge Wilson's role in the Cold War. The presidents themselves who had to wage it are remarkable for the frequency and indeed the reverence, the respect with which they talk about Wilson's importance. For example, Harry Truman, the man who I think has given us the license to call President Woodrow Wilson Woody, because that's how he referred to him in his letters home from his artillery battery in the Western Front in 1918, Truman made the point that he would steer his course by Wilsonian precepts. In his memoirs, he noted, I hoped that we would come out of this war with a going world organization for peace, and at the same time that we could help our friends and allies get back on their own feet. I was hoping to profit by the mistakes of Woodrow Wilson. I'd read carefully all of Wilson's writings and speeches on the League of Nations. I followed closely the debate in the Senate on the Versailles Treaty, and I saw how a small group of what Wilson called willful men in the Senate had managed to prevent American participation in the League. President Roosevelt had shared with me his determination to avoid the experience of Wilson by getting in advance the participation and the consent of leaders of both parties, and to include Republicans and Democrats in the delegation to San Francisco. We did not want to run the risk of another League of Nations tragedy, with the United States standing in isolation on the sidelines. Almost every president speaks somehow in these terms. When John Kennedy went to Paris, more than 40 years after Wilson had left the White House, he told the French, I have come on the same mission which occupied so many of my predecessors, stretching all the way back to President Woodrow Wilson at the conclusion of the First World War, and that is how it is possible to bind more intimately for the common interest France and the United States, Europe and the United States. President Eisenhower, who actually had marched as a brand new second lieutenant in Woodrow Wilson's first inaugural parade, confessed himself at the end of his own second term, still moved by Wilson's legacy. Wilson said, and I'm quoting, Wilson said that what we seek is the reign of law based upon the consent of the governed and sustained by the urgent opinion of mankind. Today, we have a second chance to win through to that goal, and we dare not fail. If we heed Wilson, we shall never hesitate to pay for freedom, whatever price may be required. Lyndon Johnson spoke in characteristically pungent terms of Wilson's defeat at the hands of the US Senate, and when he said, I cannot hope to emulate the accent, so please bear with me if it doesn't sound quite with the original Texan twang. Worst thing that ever happened to this country was those 60-year-old senators smelling of rat piss doing number one on Wilson's 14 points. Johnson put the point rather more delicately. He put the point rather more delicately in a speech in his 1964 election campaign against the Republican conservative Barry Goldwater, as he warned voters to go to the polling booth with Goldwater's warlike rhetoric in mind. "Don't wait like they did with Woodrow Wilson," Johnson told the voters. "Wilson envisaged a peace. He was almost in reach of it. Then he lost it, and we went to World War II." Richard Nixon saw himself as something of a re-embodiment of Wilson. He told Henry Kissinger, he also told his last political secretary, the young Monica Crowley, that not just of his admiration for Wilson, but that he felt that he too was, like Wilson, a man of action and a man of thought. Wilson was a truly great leader, Nixon told Monica Crowley in the very last year of his life. Wilson's only fault was that he wasn't realist enough to know that pragmatism had to be balanced with idealism. Idealism, running rampant, is impotent. And yet idealism really has been a constant feature of the American presidents throughout the Cold War and at its end. On January 16th, 1991, President George Bush, the elder, announced the launch of the air war against Iraq with the pledge that this military campaign would bring, quote, "a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the rule of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. A new order in which a credible United Nations can at last use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the United Nations founders." Well, that is what the presidents thought, and we have to take, I think, their view seriously. But it's also worth looking at what the scholars have said and how they have defined Wilson's legacy. They've done so in various ways. Michael Mandelbaum has defined a Wilson triad of arms restraints, popular government, and free trade, adding that they were all wrapped into international institutions to embody a rule of law. Walter Russell Mead has defined Wilson's legacy as self-determination and national independence and democracy. Lloyd Ambrosius, whom I'm delighted to see here today, has defined four main currents of Wilsonianism: national self-determination, combining national sovereignty with democratic government; the open-door policy of equal trading access, if not full free trade; collective security; and an essentially progressive view of history, that the lot of humanity may as a whole be improved with wisdom and good governance. Joseph Nye has identified the preservation of the global commons, such as the freedom of the seas, and acting as the convener of conferences and the mediator of disputes, as two other salient characteristics of the Wilsonian way. To this, we might add an abiding concern for moral authority, rooted in a conviction of what Seymour Martin Lipset has called American exceptionalism. But that classic dichotomy of idealism and realism, the one that I think was defined classically by Henry Kissinger, will not go away. It is in many ways a false dichotomy. American foreign policy, like the minds of most voters in democratic states, has always contained varying measures of both realism and idealism. American policy during the 5 decades of the Cold War illustrates the point. The strategic goal was grandly idealist, to manage this vast struggle between two fundamentally opposed systems in such a way that the devastation of nuclear war was avoided, that the physical security and the financial health of the United States and its allies were undamaged, and that the formidable challenges of decolonization and emergent new nationalisms in Asia and Africa, Latin America and the Middle East were resolved. The tactics applied during the Cold War were often crudely and even squalidly realist in the raw Bismarckian sense. Ideals were sullied in the support, for example, of French colonialism in Indochina, or even betrayed in the murderously false encouragement of Hungarian freedom fighters in 1956. Gross mistakes of judgment were made in the Vietnam War, for example, along with the coldly realistic decision to accept a bloody draw in the Korean War. Now, one lesson of the Cold War is that a stretch of history this long is something of a palimpsest that can bear almost any interpretation. It's possible to write a history of the Cold War that portrays it as a triumph of a slow and patient application of Wilsonian ideals by successors of both parties. It's equally possible to sketch such a history as a classic example of the coldest-eyed realism in American grand strategy. And to help you along, I've written both. For example, A Wilsonian history of the Cold War would go like this. The United States established in the 1940s the global institutions that would protect and eventually enrich the free democracies, and widened their ranks with a wise stewardship that guided the former enemies of Japan and West Germany firmly into the Western camp. These economic benefits were offered to the Soviet Union and its client states, but were spurned. Not without some errors and missteps that were perhaps inevitable in a spirited democracy, the United States occupied and maintained the moral high ground throughout most of the Cold War. This was achieved on the domestic front by maintaining a high growth and high productivity economy that tamed the harshness of the capitalist system, so cruelly exposed in the 1930s, provided for the poor and the elderly, and produced the world's first mass middle class. And despite intense domestic opposition, the United States dismantled the system of segregation that had been the weakest link in its moral armor, and promoted the cause of civil rights, a domestic echo of its principled commitment to the cause of global freedom. While encouraging its allies to give independence to their colonies and standing firm on the basis of international law against their French and British allies' neo-colonial venture at Suez in 1956, the United States nurtured a free alliance of willing, consenting partners. This stood in stark contrast to the dragooned satellites of Moscow, and developed a global economic system that benefited ever wider reaches of the earth and demonstrated the merits of the free and capitalist system over the sclerotic, state-controlled Soviet economy. While keeping up its strategic guard, the US chose to wait rather than fight, in the justified belief that the Soviet Union would change or collapse from the burden of its own contradictions and failings. And while the Cold War was in its way a struggle to the death between two essentially irreconcilable systems, the US maintained the diplomatic and economic connections and flexibility with Moscow that eventually allowed the Cold War to end in partnership with the enlightened leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, without nuclear war and without major bloodshed. A realist history of the Cold War might read as follows. The United States swiftly rallied the old enemies of World War II to its side as allies and subordinate partners in a global system of robust defense against communist aggression. And if European electorates seemed reluctant to support this view, the American thumb could press the electoral scales, as in Italy in 1948, to win a suitable result. Ready to wage limited wars to define and mark the boundaries of America's strategic frontiers in Asia, the US astutely managed to achieve most of its goals with carefully husbanded means, and used covert operations and armed allies, regardless of their lack of democratic credentials, to fight proxy wars to defend its interests in the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Along the way, the US managed to replace Britain as the key Western power in the Middle East, and thus to achieve an effective strategic dominance over the most important oil basins. This was achieved largely on the cheap, with a far smaller standing army than the Soviet Union, and careful exploitation of the US technological assets to stabilize the Cold War by nuclear deterrence. But this was a dynamic rather than stagnant stabilization. In the closing months of World War II, the US was able to craft a post-war economic system uniquely favorable to American strengths and American interests, promoting a series of tariff cuts and open-door policies that dismantled the British and French system of colonial preferences and allowed the dollar to become the dominant world currency. While thoughtfully allowing others to share in the general prosperity, the US became the linchpin, guarantor of a global economy of which it was the greatest beneficiary, and thus able to afford both guns and butter, aircraft carriers and private cars, and outspend, outproduce, and outlast the Soviet enemy. The US played the Cold War as a long game with the economic odds stacked in its favor. And as the weaknesses of the Soviet system became apparent, the US seized the opportunity in the 1980s at a point when the global oil price had sunk to a point that it could no longer bail out a limping Soviet economy, forcing a new high-technology arms race in which the Soviet Union was simply unable to compete. Moreover, the US dominance of the global media and its mastery of public relations skills allowed it for most of the Cold War period to win enough of the arguments in the court of global public opinion to play the role of the good guy in the white hat, despite its cold-eyed support of a great many villainous allies in very black hats around the world. As a result, not only did the US prevail in the Cold War, it was able to present and portray this American victory as a universal human triumph. enabling it to dance on the grave of a defeated communist ideology, just as it had been able to consign fascism and Nazism to history by condemning them as eternally discredited, inhuman, and unacceptable. The point is that either one of these competing narratives is partly true, but neither is true without the other, just as American foreign policy cannot fairly be defined without trying to balance these twin concepts of idealism and of realism. Now, in my view, these two alternative ways of looking at the Cold War illuminate to a great degree the continuity of American foreign policy, the degree to which people who were waging the Cold War found themselves drawing upon his lessons, drawing upon his ideas, drawing upon his rhetoric, and drawing upon his speeches. Now, if we try and pin down what exactly were the dominant characteristics of Wilson's foreign policy, I've come up, in homage to Wilson himself, with 14 points. And let me just go through them very briefly. These are characteristics of Wilson's foreign policy that I maintain can, with absolute fairness, be applied to the grand strategy with which the US waged the Cold War. First of all, arms control. Secondly, popular representative government with an objective of democratic rule was to be promoted where possible by the US. Third, the open door with an objective of free trade. 4, the building of international institutions. 5, the rule of law. 6, transparency in international dealings. Now, admittedly, the Cold War was not an example of open covenants openly arrived at, but nonetheless, Eisenhower's open skies policy, the summit meetings, there was an attempt to have a certain transparency. 7, self-determination and national independence. 8, collective security, backed if necessary by force. 9, freedom of the seas and a care for the global commons. 10, the mediation of disputes and convening of international conference to do so. 11, American moral authority in pursuit of universal principles. 12, a readiness to intervene militarily. 13, a concern for the rights of colonial peoples. 14, a genuine humanitarian concern. But, as Harry Truman noticed, there was a 15th feature of the Cold War strategy that Wilson ignored, and that was a commitment to the gaining of bipartisan political support in the US political system. This was a lesson that Wilson's successor, I think, had learned from his own defeat. Or as Dean Acheson noted of President Roosevelt in his great memoir, President of the Creation, FDR had dreamed of being, quote, the president who had succeeded where Wilson had failed. Another reason why Roosevelt and Truman succeeded where Wilson had failed may also be traced back to other lessons learned from Wilson's frustration. There was, for example, to be no repetition of the prolonged and deeply introspective peace conference of 1919, and there was to be no reenactment of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War II. Roosevelt's demand at the Casablanca summit for unconditional surrender by Germany in effect made the 1918 armistice, the 1919 conference and treaty all redundant, and thus spared the new American president the endless erosion of his goodwill and principles that had so exhausted Wilson in Paris. Now, I now want to take up a point that I think was very ably put by Professor Rosenberg, which is that one further factor, perhaps this should be my point 17, another factor in the Roosevelt-Truman success was the grand revision of traditional and orthodox economics that had come with the Great Depression, the New Deal, and the work of John Maynard Keynes. You may recall that his devastating attack upon the financial provisions of the Versailles Treaty, which he called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, was a bestseller in Britain, in the United States, as it was in Britain and in Germany. Now, Wilson claimed to believe in free trade. Indeed, one of his very first, which has been one of the 14 points, and his first address to Congress after the inauguration as president in 1913 was to promote a tariff reform bill, whose cuts meant 100 million lost in federal revenues that would be made to be made up by the new income tax. Wilson certainly believed in trade as a path to greatest prosperity, but Keynes was to be dismayed by the failure of Wilson and the other Allied leaders to grasp the economic essentials in 1919. Keynes had put forward in 1919 a plan to try and balance the alternative demands of Germany to pay reparations with the need to try and rebuild the war-battered economies of Europe. And as Keynes pointed out, the profits that the United States had made from the war, after all, the US began World War I as the world's greatest debtor nation and ended it as the world's greatest creditor nation, meant that the profits the United States had made meant she was the main available source of new capital, without which Europe's defeated powers and the victors alike would be hard-pressed to rebuild their economies. In 1947, the United States of President Truman and Secretary Marshall found the imagination to cut through the economic orthodoxies to persuade Congress to fund the Marshall Plan. In 1919, Wilson failed to see, far less to seize, the opportunity. In a letter to Duncan Grant on 14th of May 1919, Keynes wrote, "My most bitter disappointment was the collapse of my grand scheme for putting everyone on their economic legs. After getting it successfully through the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister, and seeing it formally handed to Wilson and Clemenceau, the American Treasury, from whom no more was asked than anyone else, turns it formally down as a most immoral proposal, which might cost them something, and which senators from Illinois could not look at. They had a chance of taking a large, or at least a humane view of the world, but unhesitatingly refused it. Wilson, of whom I've seen a good deal more lately, is the greatest fraud on earth." I think it is fair to say that the most important single difference between the American statesman in the aftermath of World War I and the American statesman in the aftermath of World War II, who crafted the grand strategy of the Cold War, was that those after 1945 understood the essentially symbiotic relationship between American national security and global economic stability and prosperity. They understood this to a degree that I think Wilson failed fully to grasp. And this, I think, is of central importance as one tries to calculate the role that Wilson played during the Cold War. But there is one further point that I would like to stress, and that is that Wilson certainly understood one central thing. I think the cardinal and singular merit of the Wilsonian vision was that he understood that the traditional calculations of the national interest, of wealth and weapons, of threats and capability, were lacking in a certain kind of perspective. They failed to comprehend the difference between the short-term and the long-term national interest, between the immediate and the eventual, between the temporary and the permanent. These, after all, were the terms that Wilson himself used in his address to the second plenary session at the Paris Peace Conference on the 25th of January 1919. There are many complicated questions connected with the present settlements, which perhaps cannot be successfully worked out to an ultimate issue by the decisions we shall arrive at here. It is therefore necessary, Wilson went on, that we should set up some machinery by which the work of this conference should be rendered complete. It is a solemn obligation on our part to make permanent arrangements in which justice shall be rendered and peace maintained. We may not be able to set up permanent decisions. We can set up permanent processes. The short-term interest of the United States in both 1919 and 1945 was to achieve a stable peace that was reasonable enough to endure, and flexible enough to accommodate the inevitable changes of circumstances that peace would bring. In each case, some of the future strains were obvious enough. The status and restiveness of the colonized peoples, the increasingly articulate organized demands of organized labor, the need to revive trade and economic health, the challenge of communism in Russia, of nationalism elsewhere. So the long-term interest in the United States, as Wilson foresaw, was to construct an international framework and an agreed organizing system that could cope with and manage these foreseeable future challenges to peace and security, while also ensuring that it was sufficiently loose and capable of improvement to meet the challenges of the unforeseen and unforeseeable, whether the coming of an ideology like fascism or Nazism, or a technology like the ballistic missile, the atom bomb, or in our own time, the information revolution. Now, I think in some ways Wilson's reputation has risen and fallen with the events of the day in which historians and scholars and commentators are writing about him. There is a kind of a recurrent pattern in the United States after a war. Immediately at the end of a war, and after all, the US does tend to win them on the whole, immediately after a war, the US is suffused with a great burst of idealism for constructing ways or constructing new orders that will ensure that wars do not break out again. And then come the setbacks, as they usually do. Then come the problems and the challenges, and a realism sets in, even an isolationism, as it did in the 1920s. And certainly, the initial idealism of 1945, the initial hopes of President Roosevelt for a close relationship with Joe Stalin, were not realized, and as the setbacks multiplied with the siege of Berlin, with the takeover of Czechoslovakia, a new kind of harsher realism set in that was to culminate in the adoption of NSC 68, the great Cold War planning document written by Paul Nitze after the invasion of South Korea by the North. We saw the pattern again at the end of the Cold War itself, when President Bush talked, as he did at the launch of the Gulf War, when President Bush talked of a new world order. That didn't last very long. The Clinton administration evinced a dramatic reluctance to intervene, certainly at first, in Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, to the detriment perhaps of the people who lived there. Indeed, as James Baker, Secretary of State, once noted, the Clinton administration has indulged repeatedly in Wilsonian rhetoric without Wilsonian resolve. And now we've had it again. In 2002, in the wake of the Afghan war, 2003, in the wake of the success of the Iraq war, or the apparent early success of the Iraq war, there was another wave of what's been called neoconservative Wilsonian, a great flood of idealism from the White House about the possibility of spreading democracy throughout the Middle East. And that has now also, in the having met its setbacks and reverses and disappointments, has now given way to a new kind of realism. This pattern does seem a very recurrent one in this country. The only good news I can give you is that after the ups and downs, it does tend to settle down into a reasonable balance between realism and idealism. But let's not forget that idealism. Let us not forget that the real legacy of Woodrow Wilson is in that universal dream of worldwide peace under law, a dream that would have been voiced by successive popes and successive philosophers like Immanuel Kant. Woodrow Wilson was the first great statesman to force that onto the international agenda and to keep it there in a way that it stayed enduringly and became a permanent feature, not just of American foreign policy, but a permanent feature of world concern. Perhaps the most telling epitaph for the Cold War and for the inspiration of Wilson's ideals and his legacy came from a world statesman who was not American, but who can claim to have played a very leading role in the end of the Cold War. In his address to the United Nations in 1988, 70 years almost to the day after Wilson's arrival in France to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, Mikhail Gorbachev spoke in classically Wilsonian terms to announce that the Soviet Union, a state that was just being born amid bloodshed and terror as Wilson and the Allied leaders gathered in 1919 Paris, the Soviet Union was no longer dedicated to the global dictatorship of the proletariat. Our ideal is a world community of states with political systems and foreign policies based in law, Gorbachev said. The end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union brought, I think, a measure of vindication to the scholar president, one of those prophets who found more disappointment than honor in his own land. But when President Reagan said, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev," I don't think he foresaw another one being built on the border with Mexico, but I think he certainly understood that in Mikhail Gorbachev he had found not just what Margaret Thatcher described as a communist leader with whom we could do business, but had found a man who had been as touched by the idealism of Woodrow Wilson and its promise as Reagan himself had been. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Nicely done.
Our last presenter is Professor Frank Ninkovich, Professor of History at St. John's University. Frank?
Thank you. This is very much an exercise in contemporary history, and I feel very uncomfortable, sort of like the non-smoker who was offered a joint marijuana and said, go on, it's not going to hurt you. So, like somebody else in a similar situation some years ago, I promised not to inhale. For those of you who have to catch the 4:55, my theme is fairly brief. This paper could be titled What's Left of Wilsonianism, and my answer will be very simple, not much. Indeed, in this paper I want to argue that Wilsonianism in any meaningful sense as an ideology is dead. I've been invited here to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Wilson's birth. That's a great, wonderful idea. But what I think would be truly appropriate is that Wilsonianism be given a decent burial. That's the ideology. I have three main points to my paper. One is a structural comparison between then and now. The chief object of that is to suggest that we live in a post-Wilsonian world, that we don't have the same kind of problems that Woodrow Wilson had to face, and indeed the kinds of instruments that he would have used to address them would be wholly inappropriate today. I won't have the time to get into the entirety of the argument, but I'll just mention them very briefly before getting on to the second portion of the paper, which is a discussion of the 1990s and early 2000s. And that's the narrative which argues fairly clearly, I think, that we won't find anything resembling Wilsonianism in the comments of the presidents or the chief foreign policy makers of three administrations. And the last brief portion, concluding, is a reflection on what an ideology is in the first place. And if we admit that Wilsonianism is an ism, which some people might not grant, the argument there is that's what happened to Wilsonianism is characteristic of what's happened to many isms. It has a history. It comes, it goes, it lives, it dies. So, structural differences between then and now. This is not a Wilsonian world. Which today's world differs structurally and culturally in so many respects that Wilson, if he were to rise from the dead, would have difficulty in getting his bearings. To suggest that neo-Wilsonian solutions are applicable today depends very much on whether the world is plagued by the kinds of problems that Wilson wanted to address. If we look closely, it becomes evident that the kinds of problems that he grappled with have pretty much disappeared, and that many of the new problems of this post-Cold War era do not require Wilsonian solutions. Let me just spend a little bit of time talking about the League of Nations. The League of Nations all too often tends to be conflated with the United Nations and more generally with international organization. But the point I want to make is that the League of Nations was an exceptional body. Indeed, I would argue it was the most radical experiment in international organization ever. The UN organization does not hold a candle to it in the breadth of its ambition and the mechanisms that it is, in principle, prepared to deploy. The League was intended to eliminate the problem of great power wars, wars like the Great War, providing mechanisms that would make such wars impossible. And that presumed that great powers would go off the reservation every now and then. The so-called axis of evil today consists of small to medium-sized powers who are capable of much mischief, to be sure, but can they knock the world system off its axis, as Wilson believed a great power war would do? Moreover, the League was not quite the toothless organization that it's been made out to be. The veto power is a case in point. There was no absolute veto in the League. Article 5 of the Covenant requires that council decisions be reached unanimously. But there's no veto there if a member of the council is a party to the dispute. Their vote is not counted. So in the Italian business in the mid-1930s, the Italians voted no, but their vote was disregarded. There's also an implicit threat of war with a nation that refused to abide by the recommendations of the council. And in certain cases, and here we need to get lawyers involved in parsing the language of the various articles of the League. In certain cases, only a majority vote of the Assembly is required, along with the unanimous resolution of the Council members to get action taken against an aggressor. We need to ask ourselves, for example, why Germany and Japan decided to leave this organization, simply from the matter of calculating self-interest. If they could have gummed up the works, it would have made more sense for them to stay. But the realistic rationale is, well, we got to get out of here because this organization can follow up our program. Expulsion, too, was also possible. And the case there is, that comes to mind, is the expulsion of the Soviet Union for its invasion of Finland in 1939. Probably this was illegal, but the Soviets didn't know it at the time, so they didn't contest it. But the League got away with it. These kinds of questions, great power questions, are not even remotely at issue today. Nobody's really talking about a great power war. Hypothetically, of course, people are always talking about it, but it's not a serious prospect. And despite the hegemonic status of the United States, there doesn't appear to be on the horizon any possibility of a coalition that is about to challenge it, which realist theory which suggests is bound to happen, unless you take Hugo Chavez seriously, or Chalmers Roberts' arguments about a blowback being inevitable. Probably the chief challenger to American dominance and hegemony is the United States itself. Financial weakness, manpower and supply shortages, questionable commitment to long-term policies, political divisiveness, and an uncertain public opinion have made it impossible to pursue an effective hegemonic universalism. Now, I can go on and make these arguments about the difference between then and now with regard to economic internationalism, anti-imperialism, national self-determination, democracy, and here I have to acknowledge that John Cooper has already squatted on my territory, so that I just would have been repeating points made earlier. But with all of this, I think, looking at Wilsonian solutions as they existed then, without considering the ambitious program of collective security that he had in mind, is like thinking about Einstein without relativity, Marx without his analysis of capitalism, John Coltrane without a saxophone, or I don't know how this got in here, Janet Jackson without a wardrobe malfunction. In any case, when set against today's views on international organization, this is not an apples and oranges comparison. It is apples and orangutans. Things are so different. Okay, now to part two. Daniel Moynihan used to say that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not everyone is entitled to his own facts. And here, one would think that the facts are against me, because if one were to try to gauge the health of Wilsonianism on the basis of contemporary public conversation, it would appear that Wilsonianism has experienced something of a revival. Scholars and commentators differ on points of emphasis, but the general narrative appears to go something like this. After having failed in its first incarnation, Wilsonianism was given a second chance in World War II, only to be frustrated by the emergence of the Cold War and 45 years of wrangling in the UN. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Wilsonianism 3.0 emerged in the 1990s, particularly in the Clinton administration. And following an initial rejection of core Wilsonian ideas by the Bush administration, Wilsonianism 3.5 was rolled out in the aftermath of 9/11. Well, a good starting point for a discussion of post-Cold War Wilsonianism, and a good ending point actually as well, is the triumphal post-Gulf War address to Congress of George H.W. Bush of March 6, 1991. We can see a new world coming into view, et cetera, et cetera. But there isn't very much follow-up on this, and Bush's speech is ironic, to say the least, coming from someone who was notorious for mangling what he called the vision thing. In one particularly incoherent response at a press conference in Egypt, Bush did not manage to get past the point that the New World Order had something to do with a better world. It was ironic, too, insofar as the Bush administration was notorious for its embrace of foreign policy realism, most notoriously his Chicken Kiev speech, in which he had cautioned the Ukraine and, by extension, other secessionist Soviet states against what he called suicidal nationalism. So this was a false start for Wilsonianism, and this was duly noted by foreign policy commentators at the time, who always had articles like "The Triumph of Wilsonianism?" ? Okay, so quite clearly, it wasn't getting off the ground. Well, what about the Clinton administration? With Bush voted out of office, Bill Clinton comes in, and his foreign policy national security advisor Anthony Lake, in an interview in the fall of 1993, trying to describe the policy of the administration, calls it rather mystifyingly pragmatic neo-Wilsonianism. I tried to figure out what he meant. They couldn't figure it out at the time. To me, neo-pragmatic Wilsonianism or neo-Wilsonian pragmatism sound just as good, actually, depending on your point of view. So this was greeted with a good deal of ridicule. If you look at Clinton's speeches and try to figure out what, if anything, he thought of Woodrow Wilson, he doesn't come up with very much. He didn't have very much to say about Wilson. The most interesting thing to me was that he insisted that Wilson had the biggest feet of any president, until Clinton, that is. I don't know if that's a fact, by the way, or not. He was famously preoccupied with domestic policy, and whenever Wilson was mentioned, it was almost always in a domestic context, and more often than not in the same breath as Theodore Roosevelt. Indeed, I read so much of this that I sensed that in Clinton's mind he had merged the two into a single figure that could just as well have been named Woodrow Roosevelt. The few mentions having to do with Wilson in foreign affairs range from the platitudinous to the heretical. On one occasion, he purports to quote Wilson, quote, "Our security and prosperity depend upon our willingness to be involved in the world." Woodrow Wilson said that. Americans were participants in the life of the world, like it or not. I thought, sounds familiar, but I'm not sure that Wilson actually said that. And of course he didn't. It was Theodore Roosevelt who said that. And even if it hadn't been Roosevelt, many other presidents before and after have said pretty much the same thing. Other members of the Clinton administration showed a similar indifference to Wilson. Look in Warren Christopher's memoirs, and you get one citation to Wilson. Madeleine Albright's has a few, but chiefly in connection with the formation of new nation states in Eastern Europe. And that's about it. There are some distinctly anti-Wilsonian comments as well. On one occasion, Clinton says, "We have learned that the world will never be completely safe for democracy." National self-determination, Clinton prefers to talk about federalism as the wave of the future. Interventionism, he prefers the outstretched hand of friendship. So you can understand why commentators are insisting that Clinton is basically all about trade policy and little else. Dollar diplomacy is resurrected to describe what his administration was about. The 1990s are a peculiar decade, and I have a lot here about the culture of the times. If you want to try to imagine what a liberal utopia might look like, the press coverage of the time, I think, provides a good preview. You have the media frenzies you recall over O.J. Simpson and the murder of John Benet Ramsey and the rivalry turned criminal contest between figure skaters Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan. It's just stuff like that. All of this suggests that, hey, we don't need Wilsonianism. The dangers that existed were more in the nature of nuisances, and moreover, they could be generally handled by the judicious application of air power. No boots on the ground necessary. So, despite this, Clintonian foreign policy in the 1990s leaves a good deal of dissatisfaction, and the rumblings are heard in the run-up to 2000, too soft, too idealistic, and so on. And the new administration of George H.W. Bush yearns for a more manly, muscular, nationalist approach one that's more cognizant of American military power, less concerned with what one critic called being the world's nanny. Michael Mandelbaum gave expression to this kind of criticism in his Foreign Affairs essay in 1996, titled Foreign Policy as Social Work. So the indication was that we would be going in the direction of TR, not Woodrow Wilson. If we look at the public papers of George H. Bush, first 2 years, that's the only volumes we have, there are zero mentions of Woodrow Wilson. However, sometime after 9/11, Wilsonianism was apparently rediscovered and with a vengeance by the administration. Supposedly, its articulation can be found, among other places, in the 2002 National Security Strategy, his speech to the National Endowment for Democracy, his address at Whitehall, and his second inaugural address. And in all these places, the connection between democracy and national security was elaborated, as was the willingness to use American power in pursuit of democratic regime change. So a host of commentators argued, hey, we've got new Wilsonianism here. And it had various formulations, some of which you've heard, but I'll give you a few others. Muscular Wilsonianism, Wilsonianism in boots, hard Wilsonianism, Wilsonianism with teeth, Wilsonianism with fixed bayonets, plus Fukuyama, plus force. So this new appreciation of Wilson was supposed to center on the relationship between democracy and national security. And it was a better kind of Wilsonianism than the kind previously practiced by the Democratic Party. Wilsonianism, then, as one scholarly essay put it, was, quote, the legacy that won't die. It reminded me of Jason from the Friday the 13th movies, or Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street in this regard. No matter how many times you kill it, it keeps coming back. So, frozen for a time like the corpse of Ted Williams, it was revived, presumably to become the dominant framework for understanding America's place in the world. Michael Sandel of Harvard noted, ironically, Bush's emphasis on pro-democracy, quote, puts him in the company of Wilson, the president who made liberal internationalism the core of his foreign policy. Bush, who campaigned as an ardent realist, is now quoting President Wilson and speaking about the need to make the Middle East safe for democracy. Lawrence Kaplan argues that the Democratic Party had surrendered the banner of liberal internationalism to the Republicans. William Safar says Bush evoked Woodrow Wilson trying to make the world safe for democracy. And even before the invasion of Iraq, Max Boot in the Wall Street Journal said of George W. Bush, the W stands for Woodrow. Now, not all the remarks were laudatory, and there were critiques of this so-called Wilsonianism, but much of it was, in fact, greeted with praise. If one looks at these developments more closely, there is less than meets the eye, much less, for Bush's foreign policy has little or nothing to do with Wilsonianism. Tellingly, virtually all the attributions of Wilsonianism come from outside the administration, and one will look in vain for admiring references to Woodrow Wilson or the quotations that Sandel purported to find. Indeed, a closer examination reveals that the alleged resemblance between Bush and Wilson is almost entirely the construct of media pundits who appear to know very little about Wilson apart from the misconceptions that have been handed down in popular culture. And it's amazing to what extent scholars will turn intellectual handsprings to allegedly draw some connection between Bush and Wilson. But to say that this constitutes neo-Wilsonianism is a little like saying that the $10 Rolex that I purchased from a street vendor is pretty close to the real thing. You know, if there's any one principle that we could call a core principle of Wilsonianism, it's that of international cooperation, collaboration, not the my way or the highway unilateralist approach. Multilateralism presumes consensus, not simply a coalition of the willing. And the Bush administration's attitude towards the United Nations almost inverts exactly Groucho Marx's unwillingness to join an organization that had him as a member. Well, I need to conclude here, and I have more on Iraq and the 2000s and so on, and about the actual promotion of democracy. And I agree here with Fukuyama, who has insisted recently that actually the promotion of democracy is fairly well down the list. It's number 3, 4, something like that. For the American public, by the way, most recent survey, it's number 17 or 18. Okay. Wilsonianism as an ideology. If Wilsonianism was an ideology, which is debatable, I want to suggest that it has perished. The model I use is one developed in the 1920s by social scientists who have an ideal type for characterizing the trajectories or careers of social movements, and it goes something like this. It applies to General Motors, it applies to labor union movements, it applies to politics. First, the prophet clears the ground. Second, the founder occupies it. Third, the institutionalizers who capitalize on the founder's charisma build on that ground. And lastly, at some point, the ideological heirs who bear little resemblance in their beliefs to the original spirit of the founder squander the legacy. As a result of various factors, the organization or movement reaches a point that the political scientist Theodore Loewy once famously characterized as the Jesus don't come back phase. According to Loewy, this was a stage at which a second coming could be the worst thing that had ever happened to the church. And of course, his example was the Renaissance Catholicism, which had strayed pretty far from its founding principles. Well, this typology presupposes that the original principles are capable of being revived. And here I don't think that is the case. It seems to me that there was something like Wilsonianism in the 20th century, but with each new iteration, the creed has become more and more degraded so that it bears progressively less of a resemblance to the original. The ideological half-life of Wilsonianism has passed the point at which it continues to radiate meaningful amounts of ideological energy. So, would Wilson be a neoconservative if he returned today? Would neoconservatives know what to do with him if he made an appearance? Would Wilson be driving an SUV if he appeared today? Would Bush, even after a rigorous session of waterboarding, stand up and admit, sort of like Nixon admitting he was a Keynesian, I am a Wilsonian? I don't think so. I'll conclude here. It might be protested that not all of Wilsonianism has to survive in pure form in order to qualify as an ideology that continues to exert influence over the generation. As one blogger put it, after all, a great-granddaddy doesn't pass on all of his genes, but surely Woodrow Wilson has seen to it that at least some of his genetic material has passed down to his foreign policy progeny that now run the White House. So, according to this view, Wilsonianism has passed a cultural survival test. It's transmitted by a selfish gene, as it were, that assures its continuing existence. Well, genetics is trickier than that. A better way of seeing Wilsonianism in evolutionary terms is that it is the end of one branching line of ideological development. Or better still, is what evolutionary biologists and geneticists have called genetic swamping, where potentially adaptive genetic variation appears, then disappears by being swamped back into the general population, losing its distinctiveness or purity by reverting to the norm. And that's what I want to argue, that Wilsonianism was part of a liberal worldview whence it came, and after being knocked around, to which it has returned. Lastly, all of this, I would argue, is largely a media phenomenon. But the true test of whether or not Wilsonianism is present, I think, has to do with the vibrancy of the ideas that it originally invoked. However you define it, it just mattered immensely in the past because it reflected a coherent body of analysis and ideological convictions. They were connected in a meaningful way to serious policy prescriptions. Whatever one thinks of it, Wilsonianism was able to generate great, almost religious enthusiasm among its believers in the Great War and in World War II. A sense of exaltation prompted by Wilson's imaginative ability to see redemptive possibilities in what was otherwise an unspeakably bleak world situation. One detects neither that kind of enthusiasm nor that kind of fear today. Indeed, there is no shortage of critics who suspect that the fear has been largely manufactured and used as a device for selling a different agenda. One quick and dirty definition of ideology is that it is a secular religion. If so, Wilsonianism today, to the degree that it exists, is to ideology what religion is to contemporary Europe, hollowed out and empty of meaning. Hence my subtitle, which suggests the fuller line from Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. Words, words, mere words, no matter from the heart, the effect doth operate another way. Thank you.
We are at the hour when we scheduled our adjournment, but I would like to give you the opportunity to take one or two questions. Those of you who have to leave, as Frank said, to catch the 4:55 are certainly free to do so. But I want to ask that people who have questions wait until the microphone reaches you so that our viewers on C-SPAN and webcast will be able to hear the question as well as the answer. Don Wolfensberger.
Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. I want to direct this to Martin, since he covered the Cold War period. That is, you didn't mention John F. Kennedy very much, but he's considered, I guess, in his short presidency, pretty much a hardliner, a muscular anti-communist, and he did a variation on Wilson when he said the world must be made safe for diversity. I'm wondering how you interpret that. Was it to sort of justify our alliance with undemocratic regimes against communism, or was it a more sophisticated type of Wilsonianism, idealism that recognized more the element of self-determination as opposed to what we consider democracy?
I think it's important to remember that the concept of diversity in 1961 didn't quite carry the same weight or the same meaning that it does today. I think Kennedy was very much on the defensive when looking at the developing world, the newly decolonized people, and feeling very much that the U.S. had a real problem in winning the long-term struggle for the hearts and minds of the peoples of the developing world against the Soviet Union. After all, the U.S. had these imperial colonial powers as allies. The Soviet Union had been very much more, apparently very much more welcoming to the emergence of these independent nations. And I think that for Kennedy, it's also important to realize just how central at that time in the 1960s the European cockpit still seemed to be. And when Kennedy really talked about international alliances and relations, he was referring very much more to the old world of Europe, I think, than to the kind of world we look at today of Asia and the Middle East. Indeed, in that same speech where he talked about the world being made safe for diversity, Kennedy also took the then American fashion for supporting European integration to remarkable heights. Indeed, it was Kennedy who first announced the Declaration of Interdependence with the Europeans. I think the July the 4th speech in '62 in Philadelphia. And then early the following year, in his speech in Frankfurt in the Paulskirche, Kennedy went to an extreme that not even Woodrow Wilson had ever dreamed of. He talked not only of economic integration between the United States, North America, and Europe, but he looked forward to a potential political union of Europe and the United States. A most remarkable speech, which is now broadly forgotten. So I think Kennedy's diversity wasn't quite ours, and I think Kennedy's concerns weren't quite ours, and it's important to remember, as indeed Frank has been stressing to us, that the ideas and thoughts and even ideologies of one era don't necessarily accord with today's.
John Cooper, here.
I have a question for all three of you, which I'll come to in just a second. I just want to make a couple of quick comments. Frank, I believe Harding had the biggest feet. And maybe Frank Osella can tell us, because I think Wilson, those shoes indicate to me that he did have long, thin feet, long, narrow feet. But Harding's the champ until Clinton. Emily, I agree with you when you talk about the anti-interventionists, at least up to a point. And by the way, to me, isolationism is not a pejorative term. I think it can and should be used non-pejoratively. But where I don't follow you is the same place that ultimately I don't follow Casey Johnson, which is you can see all of this, you can see that very progressive, which I think they deserve fond memories and for. But after 1937, when push comes to shove, there is that rejection of collective security. There is that rejection of being called to intervene, and in a very wrenching kind of thing. But with the exception of George Norris, perhaps, and maybe one or two others, they're still where they were in World War I. So I think it has to be seen in that continuity. My question for all three of you is to pick up on something that Frank said about the conflation of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And Patty O'Toole reminded me that today is Theodore Roosevelt's birthday. And by the way, I don't know whether Wilson Center is planning a 150th for him in 2 years, but might be a nice idea. Hint. Whom do you see, and I'd say especially with FDR, but if you want to broaden this out some more, whom do you see as the greater influence, the greater legator in this? Because the Wilsonian model for international involvement and for an activist role for the United States in the world is not the only one. Theodore Roosevelt had another one. I don't prefer Lloyd realism for this, because I think there are large elements of idealism in that as well. And never mind. In the League debate, I think realism was as scarce as hen's teeth there. But you do have another model, which is this model of, I'd call it reformed or dressed up imperialism, the great power directorate. Will manage the world. And FDR, for example, was uniquely situated to be the legatee of both of them. And which one? Or do we meld them together? But which one do you think had the greater influence? Ladies first.
Oh, Emily, you want
to? I'm not going to tackle that directly on. I'm just going to say that I think that Wilson's great influence, whatever you want to say about policy itself, comes in the realm of rhetoric. And I do think that Wilson bequeathed a certain rhetorical tradition to American foreign policy that proved very rooted, and much more so than Roosevelt did. I would just like to leave it at that. There was a famous essay written years ago called Getting Right with Lincoln that talked about the way in which presidential discourses in a certain period always had to invoke the strains of Lincoln in order to be credible. And I've always kind of thought you could do a similar article called Getting Right with Wilson, and I think this is partly why Wilson gets invoked over and over, even when it's totally inappropriate. There's a rhetorical tradition there that is very, very powerful, I think, in American life, quite apart from policy judgments. That is what I see as one of Wilson's most important legacies, much more so than Roosevelt in that regard.
Yeah, good point. Martin?
I would agree with that, but I think that there is something more than just rhetorical force behind this legacy. I think it does chime, it does accord with something in the nature of the American electorate that likes a high moral appeal, that likes to feel good about itself and about its role in the world. And I think that's one reason why you find presidents of both parties constantly citing this kind of Wilsonian rhetoric. It goes down well. It plays well even in Peoria. When it comes to Roosevelt, the tradition of Teddy Roosevelt or of Wilson, I think it's terribly important to realize the extraordinary difference that took place between the world of 1919 and the world of 1945. In 1919, the US fielded the smallest of the Allied armies. that finally defeated Germany. The US was unable to deliver any of its own aircraft engines, any of its own built aeroplanes. The US was equipped with French artillery, with French aircraft, British aircraft. It was supplied out of British and American stocks very largely. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson was entering into a world of, in effect, equals at 1919. Just as when Teddy Roosevelt was talking about getting into the great power game and America becoming part of this of the great powers of the world, he was also talking at a time when the US didn't have one fraction of the dominance it enjoyed in 1945. In 1945, the British game was up. The last time when the British had been even equal on the battlefields of France had been in the month of D-Day. Thereafter, the US manpower, let alone its industrial power, became overwhelming. So the US was looking by 1945, 1950, in that period, at a time when it really only had one competitor, one equal, and that was the Soviet Union. And so that great power concert of which Roosevelt dreamed of joining was simply not there. Now, what I think is going to be interesting is it seems to me that now that it's clear to even the Bush administration that the unipolar moment of American hegemony is drawing to a close, I would suggest that we are probably heading back in this century to a new kind of concert of great powers. This time the Europeans individually won't be there. They might be there as the European Union. But I can see the US having to share a kind of a co-responsibility for the peace and order of the planet with the Chinese, with the Indians, perhaps with the Europeans, who knows, perhaps with the revived Russians. But at that point, I think we might find Teddy Rooseveltian rhetoric returning, although given its muscularity, I do rather hope not. We foreigners do tend to react better to the high-minded idealism of Wilson than to the hard-nosed neo-imperialism or proto-imperialism of Teddy Roosevelt.
Thanks, Mark. Frank?
I wrote a book called The Wilsonian Century and not the Rooseveltian Century. So I'll vote for Wilson. I think that his greatness, even though his political program failed after the war, consisted of his understanding that things had changed in a fundamental sense in international relations. Now, if you go back to the 19th century, you find a lot of talk about globalization, but you find among American intellectuals a failure to understand how this would affect international politics. So much of the discourse is typically in terms of international law and protecting neutral rights and all the usual stuff. And what Wilson realizes is that this war is bringing globalization's chickens home to roost in a military manner that is unsustainable. And I think that's why so many people rallied to him. They thought, well, this guy really knows what this otherwise senseless war is all about. Now, Roosevelt, if your test of greatness is doing, I think certainly one could make the argument that he was far more important because he makes an effective global presence of the United States and begins building institutions that are capable of managing the international system. But in order to do that, you have to understand what that world is like first. And I think FDR got that understanding from Wilson.
Good. Well, I think that's a good point to conclude. Perhaps those of you who have questions can bring them to members of the panel as they're making their way out. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for this very long day of symposia, and to thank the committee that organized the meeting, thank the Wilson House, and to thank all of you for sticking with it through the day, and to wish you a good weekend. Thank you.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sticking literally to our chairs. Martin.
I loved your characterization of the two traditions. I hope that will be in the book, because that would be great fun to use in class. It was wonderful.